Finally, a single place where you can interpret liver labs like a pro. Just like a top longevity clinic would do, this tool interprets liver markers using both normal and optimal reference ranges, then calculates the best indices for steatosis and fibrosis. If something is not right, it automatically runs differential diagnosis algorithms and recommend next steps based on the latest clinical guidelines. And it even gives you structured AI insights, plus the ability to chat with the results. I built this interpreter with help from the leading experts, the same doctors and researchers who developed the best-in-class indices used in this tool. Hi, my name is Zsolt, and I specialize in building blood interpretation tools used by longevity clinics. My personal mission is to extend human lifespan by collectively adding 1 million years to people's lives. That's why I make tools like this completely free, no email or sign up required. Before we dive in, just a quick heads up. This video will be a bit technical, since it's basically a quick guide on how to use the interpreter. Alright, let's get started. Since the results page is very long, let me give you a quick high-level overview. It is useful to think about it in individual sections, where the information flows from the bottom to the top. At the bottom, you will see interpretations of individual liver markers, things like ALT, AST, and bilirubin. But here, each one is interpreted only in isolation. One level up, you will find calculated predictions for steatosis and fibrosis. There are 2 indices for each, and I will explain them in a moment. Depending on the results, the interpreter might also run differential diagnosis algorithms. For example, if steatosis or fibrosis is suspected, it runs an algorithm that tries to differentiate between alcohol versus metabolic origin. And finally, at the top, we have the summary of the results with the recommended next steps and the AI tool. It gives doctors a quick high-level overview, but also allows them to progressively dig deeper if they need to. Okay, let's finally interpret some results. First, enter the liver panel results here. Don't worry if you don't have all of them. I made it so all the inputs are optional, and the tool will calculate everything it can from whatever data you provide. Liver markers are sensitive to exercise, so it's a good practice to ask the patient to avoid intense workouts for about 5 days before the blood test. For best results, they can follow the instructions on my page, what to do and what to avoid before the blood draw. The link is in the description. For this quick demo, I will just load some sample data. Let's choose a patient with a fatty liver, which is the most common liver disease. Okay, let's start from the bottom. Here you can see the interpretation of individual blood biomarkers. Liver enzymes can originate from several tissues, not just the liver. So for each enzyme, the tool shows which tissues are the major and minor contributors to its levels found in the blood. For example, ALT also originates in muscle, pancreas, and gut. So its levels also rise after exercise or in conditions like a celiac disease. If a value is above or below the optimal range, it will show you the most common possible reasons that could cause it. So for this patient, it automatically displayed the information relevant to high ALT, but you can always glance at what a low value would mean by switching the tab. I also showed the multiple of the upper normal range. You might be wondering why the normal range is not the same as the optimal one. The normal range is what comes with your blood test, and it's basically a statistical average of what's common in the population. On the other hand, optimal is what's associated with the best health outcomes. That's why you will often hear longevity doctors like Peter Attia say that they completely ignore these reference ranges. It's a bit complex topic, so I will make a separate video about it. For now, let's get back into how this liver function test interpreter works. When the liver is under stress, it often reacts in 2 ways, by storing fat or by forming scar tissue. The buildup of fat is called steatosis, while the buildup of scar tissue is called fibrosis. The gold standard for diagnosing both is a liver biopsy. But biopsy only examines a tiny part of the liver and it's invasive. The best non-invasive option is an MRI, but it's expensive and time-consuming. Other non-invasive tests like ultrasound and fibroscan each have their own pros and cons. Feel free to pause here for a look at the comparison table. So for practical purposes, mathematical models were developed to predict steatosis and fibrosis from routine lab tests. They too have their limitations, but I have built 4 ways to partially compensate for them. First, I calculate 2 indices wherever possible. So these 2 are for steatosis, these 2 for fibrosis, and so on. Second, I use the best performing indices, the ones that consistently outperform others in comparative studies. For example, in this study, you can see that the best index for predicting fatty liver was FLI, closely followed by TYG-BMI. Third, I make sure to use the optimal cutoffs. For each index, I plot all the studies visually with the reference standards and determine the optimal cutoff based on that. And lastly, it's important to remember that these prediction models are just a simple linear calculations. But if you click this little math icon, you will see exactly how each result was calculated and how much each value contributes to the final score. That way, the doctor can spot any outlier that might be skewing the results one way or another. Okay, so now we know that mathematical models are the most practical, but they have their limitations, and that this tool partly overcomes those limitations. Now, let's take a quick look at the fibrosis indices. In clinical practice, fibrosis is most commonly predicted using FIB-4 index. It's called FIB-4 because it's calculated from 4 parameters. But I didn't include FIB-4 in this interpreter because it relies too heavily on age as one of the inputs, which means you have to use different cutoffs for different age groups, and that gets messy real fast. That's why FIB-3 was developed. It's a cleaner replacement for FIB-4 since it doesn't include age and actually performs better. Another great index is the liver stiffness score, developed and validated on the enhanced dataset. One nice feature of LSS is that it gives percentage probabilities for each stage of fibrosis separately. Both of these indices outperform traditional indices like FIB-4, APRI, and HSI. So, now we know that this patient has a high likelihood for steatosis and a low likelihood of fibrosis. Based on these findings, the interpreter automatically runs additional differential diagnostic calculations. These calculations are only run when the results are clinically meaningful. So each calculation has its own trigger when it should run and when it shouldn't. That's why only these 2 differential diagnostic calculations were run. The first one is ANI index, which helps distinguish alcoholic from non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Anything above 0 leans towards alcohol, and anything below 0 leans towards NAFLD. We can see that this is a clear NAFLD result, and the probability of alcohol liver disease is only 1%. It is important to note here that all other causes must be excluded to trust these results. More on it later. Next up is the R factor, which is a quick way to classify acute liver injury. NAFLD is obviously chronic, but since this tool can't tell, it was calculated anyway. NAFLD typically lands around 2 to 6, so mostly in the mixed category. The last differential diagnosis calculation is the direct to total bilirubin ratio. This index was not calculated for this NAFLD patient, since the ratio has little clinical relevance when the total bilirubin is not elevated. But to see it in action, let's load some sample data for a patient with alcohol-associated cirrhosis, which is an end-stage liver disease. Now, if we look at the bilirubin ratio, we can see it's somewhere between hepatocellular and cholestatic pattern. I also show a full bilirubin breakdown in both percentage and absolute values. So our patient has a total bilirubin of 4.2 and 52% of that is conjugated. I have also attached handy tables showing different liver conditions and their bilirubin breakdowns, so we can quickly compare. If we look at the table from the first study, we see that patients with chronic alcoholic cirrhosis had on average about 51% conjugated bilirubin. So this might serve as another small piece of the puzzle. Okay, let's switch back to our NAFLD patient, since non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is the most common cause of elevated liver enzymes. As you have seen, the information flows from the bottom up, each layer building on the previous one. That's why at the top we see the summary of all the results. For this patient, we can see that there is a high likelihood of fatty liver and that it's likely from non-alcoholic metabolic origin. On the other hand, it hasn't likely progressed to significant fibrosis yet. Indeterminate risk means that the early F2 stage can be ruled in or ruled out. If you remember, this patient had a low risk according to FIB-3 index and 27% probability of stage F2 fibrosis based on the LSS index. That's why I use two indices, and if they slightly disagree, I go with the worst one. I also display some supporting calculations like BMI. Here, we can see that this patient is technically obese, at level 1 obesity. One issue with BMI is that it doesn't distinguish between fat and muscle mass. So, it can be misleading for bodybuilders and such. But what often happens in practice is that a perfectly average person thinks BMI doesn't apply to them, because they heard it on a podcast. Instead of correcting them, I find it more helpful to show them waist-to-height ratio, which is anyway a better predictor for cardiometabolic risk than BMI. So, we have gone through all the interpretations and now it's time to decide what to do with the information. And good news is, there are guidelines for that. The guidelines clearly state that patients with abnormal liver blood test should be considered for investigation with the liver etiology screen, irrespective of level and duration of abnormality. So what's included in the liver etiology screen? You can find it in a table too. In the clinic, we use our own set of tests, a mix of the standard panel, extended panel, and a few extra tests that aren't listed here. It is important to note that this next step only appears if at least one key liver enzyme is above the normal range. So this step is not triggered by crossing the optimal range, only after normal range is crossed too. That's because I wanted to stay consistent with the guideline definition. But the guidelines acknowledge the issue with normal range cutoff with the following example of two patients. A patient with an acute hepatitis A who has a sky-high ALT, and a second patient with hepatitis C who has ALT still within the normal range. Yet, 10 years later, the first one is alive and well, while the second might already have end-stage liver disease. In case of abnormal tests, I also displayed the decision tree and a link to the full guidelines. But honestly, I believe the future of clinical guidelines will look completely different. Instead of hundreds of pages of static documents, doctors should be presented with an interactive tool like this. A tool that handles all the calculations and surfaces the relevant information. So, if you know someone involved in writing clinical guidelines, please send them this video and let's create the first next generation guidelines together. I saved the best feature for last. You can actually discuss all these interpretations with an AI. All you need to do is enter a few extra details. Things like patient age, self-reported alcohol intake, medication, symptoms, medical history, etc. These are all basic questions any liver specialist would ask. Since alcohol intake is measured in standard drinks, I have added a quick reference right here. For example, 1 small beer equals to 1 unit of alcohol and so on. So let's enter some data. Let's say our patient is 35 years old, drinks 5 large beers a week, so that's around 10 units of alcohol, no meds and some diarrhea. After you click continue, you can copy the generated AI prompt to your clipboard. Now open the best reasoning model you have access to and paste it in. As you can see, the interpreter generated quite a long prompt. It includes everything you saw visually, but now in a raw text format. That means all the basic information, all individual blood markers with optimal ranges, all the calculations and their meanings, links to the latest guidelines, and so on. So let's run it and see the results. The prompt also includes exact instructions on how to respond, so you don't need to add anything to it. Because the so-called liver enzymes can come from other tissues too, it shows a breakdown of tissue origins and if it's a possible contributor or not. It's not rare to see more than one pathology, so this highlights what's plausible and what's unlikely. The second section is for etiology breakdown. Here, the AI is instructed to provide the most likely diagnosis. In this case, it's most likely NAFLD, but it also correctly pointed out other plausible contributors, like a celiac disease. Personally, I would still run all the tests recommended in the guidelines, but if you can't run them all, this might help you prioritize. The last section is there to help the doctor present the findings to the patient. Because no matter how good the doctor is, if the patient doesn't listen, it doesn't work. That's why the AI is instructed to write a summary in a way that maximizes patients' adherence. I don't know about you, but I really like this output because Instead of basing its knowledge from random sources on the internet, it provides information straight from the latest clinical guidelines. It's grounded in the real calculations, so it doesn't hallucinate. And the output is nicely structured by default, but you can always ask follow-up questions. This tool was developed for longevity clinics and took me 6 months to build. But I understand that not everyone has access to a precision health clinic. So I just had to make it public to help as many people as possible. If you represent a hospital, a lab, or an outpatient system, feel free to reach out. Let's discuss how we could integrate this into your software so even more people can benefit. In the meantime, I will keep updating and improving this tool. That's it, guys. Stay healthy, stay optimal. Bye. This content is for informational purposes only. It is not a substitute for a professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Please consult your healthcare provider for any medical concerns.